They say knowledge is power, but sometimes knowledge is a curse that follows you into the darkest corners of sleep. My name is irrelevant now. What matters is what I witnessed during the Terran conflict of 2387. I was a xenobiologist, selected by the Galactic Observation Council to study human combat behavior during their war against the Zephyrian Empire. What I expected to document was another species' inevitable surrender when faced with superior technology and numbers. What I actually recorded changed everything we thought we knew about humanity and about ourselves. The humans didn't just fight. They didn't just resist. They became something else entirely when pushed to their limits. This is not a tale of heroes and villains. This is the clinical observation of a species that refuses to understand the meaning of impossible. What you're about to read are my field notes, translated from the original Kepler standard, detailing events that the Galactic Council has classified beyond your highest security clearance. I've watched civilizations rise and fall across a dozen star systems. I've seen species adapt, evolve, and overcome challenges that would have destroyed lesser beings. But I had never seen anything like what humans call going to war. They warned me that humans were unpredictable. They never told me they were terrifying. The assignment came through official channels on a Tuesday, though humans would later teach me that Tuesdays held no special significance in the greater cosmos. I was reviewing cellular regeneration patterns in Altaria moss when a communication crystal on my desk began pulsing with a deep blue light that indicated priority council business. Dr. Kethvar Nimtel had served the Galactic Observation Council for 47 standard years. In that time, I had documented the mating rituals of the crystalline SH star, survived 3 months embedded with the nomadic gas breathers of Epsilon Eridani, and even managed to catalog the complete life cycle of the infamous Betelgeuse brain slugs without losing my sanity. My colleagues consider me thorough, methodical, and, above all, unflappable. The message was brief, as Council communications always were. Report to Station Omega, 7 for immediate deployment. Classification, Deep Field Observation. Subject, Homo sapiens, Combat Behavior Analysis. Duration, indefinite. I remember feeling a mixture of excitement and mild concern. Humans were a relatively new addition to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 60 years prior. Most of my colleagues dismissed them as another primitive species that would either adapt to galactic civilization or fade into obscurity like countless others before them. Their technology was adequate but unremarkable. Their social structures seemed chaotic and inefficient. Their biology was standard carbon-based, nothing that hadn't been seen thousands of times before. What made the assignment unusual was the combat observation aspect. The Council rarely bothered studying military behavior unless a species showed particular promise or posed a potential threat. Humans have been involved in several minor border skirmishes since joining the galactic community, but nothing that should have warranted special attention. Station Omega 7 orbited a dead star in what humans called the neutral zone, a buffer region between the Terran Federation and the expanding Zephyrian Empire. The station served as a monitoring post and diplomatic way station, one of dozens scattered throughout the galaxy to keep watch over emerging conflicts. Commander Veltar greeted me at the docking bay with the kind of efficiency that suggested he had more important things to worry about than one xenobiologist and his research equipment. Veltar was Centaurian, a species known for their analytical minds and emotional restraint. His 4 arms moved in precise, economical gestures as he spoke. Dr. Nimtel, welcome to Omega Shedem. I trust your journey was satisfactory. His voice carried the musical undertones characteristic of his species, but there was an edge to it that I hadn't expected. Quite satisfactory, Commander. I'm eager to begin my observations. The briefing materials were somewhat sparse. Veltar's primary arms folded across his chest while his secondary arms gestured for me to follow him through the station's corridors. The walls here were lined with tactical displays showing ship movements throughout the sector. Red dots represented Zephyrian forces, blue indicated Terran positions, and yellow marked neutral or unidentified vessels. The situation has been developing rapidly, Veltar explained as we walked. 3 weeks ago, the Zephyrians began what they call a consolidation operation in this sector. They've been systematically occupying human colonies and mining operations. Standard Imperial expansion, nothing we haven't seen before. I nodded, making mental notes. The Zephyrian Empire was ancient by galactic standards, having conquered and absorbed hundreds of species over the past millennium. They were known for their overwhelming military superiority and their efficient integration of conquered peoples. Most species submitted after the first demonstration of Zephyrian power. What makes this situation unique? I asked. Veltar stopped walking and turned to face me. His large, dark eyes held an expression I couldn't quite interpret. The humans aren't surrendering. We entered the observation deck, a vast chamber dominated by a massive transparent aluminum viewport that offered an unobstructed view of the surrounding space. Banks of monitoring equipment lined the walls, their displays showing everything from gravimetric readings to quantum communication intercepts. Not surrendering is hardly unusual, I said, settling into the workstation that had been prepared for me. Many species require several demonstrations of superior force before accepting the inevitable. Dr. Nimtel, Veltar, said quietly, the Zephyrians have destroyed 12 human colonies. They've demonstrated their superiority quite thoroughly. Any rational species would have opened surrender negotiations by now. I began unpacking my equipment, arranging sensors, and recording devices with practiced efficiency. Perhaps the humans simply need more convincing. Some species are more stubborn than others. Perhaps, Veltar replied, but his tone suggested he doubted this explanation. Your observation target will be the human defensive fleet assembled near the Kepler 442 system. Intelligence indicates a major engagement is imminent. Over the next several hours, I familiarized myself with the tactical situation. The Zephyrian force consisted of approximately 800 vessels, ranging from massive dreadnoughts to swift fighter craft. Their technology was proven and reliable, having been refined through countless conquests. Their commanders were experienced, their crews disciplined, their strategy time-tested. The human force numbered just over 200 ships, most of them converted civilian vessels hastily fitted with weapons and armor. Their fleet included cargo haulers with missile pods welded to their hulls, passenger liners bristling with improvised weapon systems, and mining ships that had been transformed into mobile fortresses. The few actual military vessels looked primitive compared to their Zephyrian counterparts. This won't be much of a battle, I observed to Lieutenant Zerdich, a young Kepler female who had been assigned as my research assistant. The humans are outnumbered 4-1, and their technology is clearly inferior. Zara Th's tentacles writhed in what I had learned was her species' equivalent of uncertainty. Perhaps, Doctor, but the betting pools among the crew are surprisingly even. Many of them think the humans have a chance. I found this curious. Station Omega-7's crew represented 15 different species, most of them experienced military observers. They had witnessed countless conflicts across the galaxy. If they thought this battle would be anything other than a quick Zephyrian victory, there must be something about human military doctrine that I was missing. I spent the remainder of the day reviewing available data on human combat behavior. Their species had an unusually violent history, having spent most of their development fighting wars against their own kind. Unlike most species, which typically unified before achieving space travel, humans had carried their conflicts off-world, fighting several wars in their own solar system before finally establishing a unified government. What struck me as particularly unusual was the human approach to casualties. Most species engaged in warfare with the understanding that preservation of life was the ultimate goal. Conflicts were typically resolved when one side demonstrated clear superiority, at which point the weaker force would surrender to prevent unnecessary deaths. Humans appeared to operate under different principles. Their historical records showed numerous examples of forces fighting to the last individual rather than surrendering, even when facing impossible odds. They seemed to view death in battle as acceptable, sometimes even preferable to surrender. This attitude was so foreign to galactic thinking that most xenobiologists dismissed it as primitive behavior that would disappear as the species matured. I had initially shared this view, but as I reviewed the data, I began to wonder if we had misunderstood something fundamental about human nature. The first indication that this conflict would be different from my expectations came during the night shift. I was reviewing sensor logs when Zara Th approached my workstation, her tentacles moving in agitation. Doctor, you need to see this communication intercept. The message was simple, broadcast on an open channel from the human fleet commander to his Zephyrian counterpart, Admiral Kreshtar, This is Admiral Sarah Chun of the Terran Defense Force. You have committed acts of aggression against civilian populations under the protection of the Terran Federation. Withdraw from this system immediately, or we will remove you. I read the message twice, certain I had misunderstood something. They're demanding that the Zephyrians withdraw? With a force one-fourth the size? That's not the strangest part, Zarth said, manipulating the console to bring up additional data. Look at the human fleet's positioning. The tactical display showed something that defied conventional military logic. Instead of forming defensive positions or attempting to use the system's gravitational bodies for cover, the human fleet was advancing directly toward the Zephyrian force. They weren't trying to defend anything or delay the enemy advance. They were attacking. I spent several minutes checking and rechecking the sensor data, convinced there must be some error. No rational commander would order such a maneuver. It was tactically unsound, strategically pointless, and guaranteed to result in the complete destruction of the human force. Have they responded to Admiral Chen's ultimatum? I asked. Zarth brought up the Zephyrian response. Admiral Kreshtar's message was equally brief, but carried the weight of 1,000 conquered worlds. Human fleet, you are hereby ordered to surrender immediately. Comply, and your crews will be relocated to suitable worlds within the Empire. Resist, and you'll be destroyed. You have 1 standard hour to respond. I settled back in my chair, preparing to document what I expected would be humanity's inevitable surrender. No species had ever continued fighting after receiving such an ultimatum from the Zephyrian Empire. The Empire's reputation for overwhelming force and efficient conquest was legendary. Resistance was not just futile, it was inconceivable. Admiral Chen's response arrived exactly 59 minutes later. Admiral Kreshtar, the Terran Federation does not negotiate with invaders. We do not surrender our people to slavery. We do not yield to threats. You want the system? Come and take it. The communication ended with something I had never encountered in any military context. The humans transmitted their location directly to the Zephyrian fleet. They weren't just refusing to surrender. They were challenging their enemies to find them and fight. In 47 years of observing galactic conflicts, I had never seen anything like it. Species fought for resources, territory, or survival. They engaged in careful calculations of cost and benefit. They surrendered when the mathematics of war turned against them. Humans, apparently, operated according to different mathematics entirely. As I watched the two fleets begin their final approach toward each other, I realized that everything I thought I knew about warfare was about to be challenged. The Zephyrian fleet moved with the precise formations and measured pace of countless previous conquests. The human fleet advanced like something wild and untamed, their ships spreading out in patterns that seemed random but somehow purposeful. Admiral Kreshtar had conquered 47 star systems. He commanded forces that had never known defeat. His ships were technologically superior, his crews expertly trained, his tactics proven through a millennium of successful campaigns. Admiral Sarah Chun commanded a collection of converted civilian vessels crewed by volunteers who had never fought a major space battle. Her fleet was outnumbered, outgunned, and operating far from any hope of reinforcement. As the two forces closed to weapons range, I began to understand why the crew of Station Omega-7 had been betting on the humans. There was something in the way they moved, something in their communications, something in their very approach to this impossible situation that suggested they might not understand that they were supposed to lose. The battle that followed would change everything I thought I knew about humanity, about warfare, and about the fundamental nature of intelligent life in the galaxy. But in those final moments before the first shots were fired, I was still thinking like a civilized being. I had no idea what humans became when civilization stopped working. The first exchange of fire began at 1427 Standard Time, and within seconds I understood that every assumption about human military doctrine was wrong. The Zephyrian fleet opened the engagement with their traditional overwhelming barrage, designed to demonstrate superior firepower and encourage immediate surrender. Massive energy beams lanced across space, striking the leading human vessels with enough force to vaporize a small moon. The displays on Omega-7 lit up with impact signatures as the first wave of attacks found their targets. 3 human ships died in that first salvo, their hulls cracking open like eggs as atmosphere and debris vented into space. I waited for the surviving human vessels to request quarter to begin broadcasting surrender codes, to show some sign of rational behavior in the face of such overwhelming force. Instead, they accelerated. Are the sensors malfunctioning? I asked Lieutenant ZRTH, staring at readings that couldn't possibly be accurate. It shows the human fleet is increasing velocity toward the Zephyrian line. ZRTH's tentacles were rigid with stress, but her voice remained steady. Sensors are operating normally. Doctor, the humans are closing to point-blank range. What followed challenged everything I knew about space combat. The human fleet didn't attempt to match the Zephyrians' long-range firepower or engage in the careful maneuvering that characterized civilized warfare. Instead, they drove straight into the teeth of the enemy formation with a recklessness that bordered on insanity. The converted cargo hauler Defiant took a direct hit from a Zephyrian dreadnought's main battery. The ship's forward sections were completely destroyed, yet the vessel continued on its collision course with the enemy flagship. As I watched in horrified fascination, the Defiant's crew jettisoned their remaining cargo containers, each one packed with improvised explosives, creating an expanding field of deadly debris. "This is suicide," I whispered, but even as I spoke, I saw the method in the madness. The Zephyrian formation, designed for long-range combat, couldn't adapt quickly enough to the humans' wild charge. Ships that had never needed to worry about ramming attacks found themselves desperately trying to avoid collisions with vessels that showed no intention of changing course. The human ship Indomitable, a converted passenger liner, took severe damage from multiple Zephyrian vessels, but somehow managed to reach the enemy destroyer Kethmar. Instead of attempting to board or disable the Zephyrian ship, the Indomitable simply opened fire with everything it had at point-blank range. The two vessels exchanged fire for less than 30 seconds before both were reduced to expanding clouds of superheated plasma. "They're trading ship for ship," ZRTH observed, her voice filled with something approaching awe. "They're not trying to win through superior tactics or technology. They're just trading." I began to understand the horrifying logic of the human strategy. They couldn't outfight the Zephyrians in a conventional engagement, so they had chosen to make the cost of victory unacceptable. Every human ship that died took at least one Zephyrian vessel with it, and sometimes more. The mathematics were brutally simple. If the pattern continued, both fleets would cease to exist. Admiral Kreshtar apparently reached the same conclusion. The Zephyrian fleet began attempting to withdraw to long range, where their superior weapons could be used without risking close-quarters combat. But the humans wouldn't let them disengage. Human ships that could no longer fight effectively used their remaining power to ram damaged Zephyrian vessels, or to position themselves where they could prevent enemy ships from escaping. The mining vessel Thor's Hammer had lost most of its weapons and all of its main engines when I noticed it drifting toward a cluster of Zephyrian cruisers. For several minutes, the ship appeared to be nothing more than another piece of battle debris. Then, it exploded with the force of a small star. "What was that?" I demanded, working frantically at my console to analyze the explosion signature. "Fusion reactor overload," ZRTH replied after checking her instruments. They deliberately caused a catastrophic failure in their power plant. The explosion had vaporized the Thor's Hammer and 2 Zephyrian cruisers, while severely damaging 3 other enemy vessels. The humans had deliberately sacrificed their own ship to maximize damage to the Zephyrian fleet. It was tactically brilliant and absolutely terrifying. As the battle continued, I began to notice patterns in human behavior that defied everything I knew about military psychology. When ships were damaged beyond effective combat capability, their crews didn't evacuate. Instead, they used their vessels as weapons, ramming enemy ships or positioning themselves to block retreat routes. When individual crew members were cut off from their units, they didn't surrender. They fought with whatever weapons they could find until they were killed. The Zephyrian destroyer Veldar managed to board the human cruiser Washington after a devastating exchange of fire. I monitored the communications as Zephyrian shock troops attempted to secure the vessel. The battle inside the ship lasted for over an hour, with human crew members fighting for every corridor, every room, every inch of their vessel. What disturbed me most was how the humans fought when they knew they couldn't win. The Washington's crew had been reduced to less than 50 individuals, facing over 200 Zephyrian soldiers. Any rational beings would have surrendered, accepted capture, and hoped for eventual rescue or prisoner exchange. Instead, they destroyed their own ship. The Washington's final transmission was brief, for Earth. For our children. For everyone who comes after us. Then, the ship's reactor went critical, taking the Washington, the Veldar, and both crews with it. I found myself physically shaking as I tried to process what I was witnessing. This wasn't warfare as understood by galactic civilization. This was something primal and violent that spoke to the deepest, most savage impulses of intelligent life. "Doctor," Zardh said quietly, "you need to see this." She had been monitoring communications from the human fleet, and what she showed me changed my understanding of human psychology forever. I had expected to find chaos, panic, and desperation in their transmissions. Instead, I found something far more unsettling. The humans were singing. Not all of them, and not constantly, but across multiple vessels and communication channels, human crew members were singing songs from their homeworld. Some were martial anthems that spoke of honor and sacrifice. Others were simple melodies about home and family. A few were religious hymns that called upon various human deities for strength and courage. Why are they doing this? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "I believe," Zardh said slowly, "they're not afraid." This observation struck me as impossible. Every rational being feared death, especially violent death in the cold vacuum of space. Fear was the foundation of military discipline, the force that made soldiers follow orders and accept surrender when continued fighting became pointless. But as I listened to the human communications, I heard no fear. I heard determination, anger, grief for fallen comrades, and grim satisfaction when they destroyed enemy vessels. What I didn't hear was the kind of terror that should have been paralyzing beings who were facing certain death. The battle's turning point came when Admiral Chen's flagship, the carrier Lexington, found itself surrounded by 4 Zephyrian capital ships. The massive human vessel had taken severe damage and was clearly outgunned. Admiral Kreshtar himself moved his command ship into position to accept the Lexington surrender. Chen's response was transmitted on an open channel, ensuring that every ship in both fleets could hear it. "Admiral Kreshtar, I want you to remember this moment. Remember that you had the chance to leave in peace. Remember that we warned you what would happen if you refused. And remember that what happens next is entirely your choice." What happened next redefined my understanding of human naval tactics. The Lexington launched every fighter it had remaining, not at the surrounding Zephyrian ships, but at the enemy fleet's command vessel. The small craft were heavily damaged and clearly couldn't survive long enough to reach their target through the defensive fire. But they weren't trying to survive. Each fighter was packed with explosives and guided by a human pilot who had volunteered for what they called a final run. 18 human fighters died, trying to reach Admiral Kreshtar's flagship. The 19th succeeded. The explosion tore through the Zephyrian command ship's bridge, killing Admiral Kreshtar and his senior staff instantly. Without their command structure, the Zephyrian fleet's coordination began to collapse, and the humans pressed their advantage with terrifying efficiency. Ships that had been fighting defensively suddenly became aggressive, closing to ramming range regardless of the damage they took. Vessels that had been attempting to withdraw turned around and charged back into combat. The humans had smelled blood in the water, and they attacked with the focused intensity of natural predators. I watched Admiral Chen coordinate her fleet's final assault while her own ship burned around her. The Lexington's bridge had taken multiple hits, and I could see through the tactical feeds that at least half of her crew was dead or wounded. Chen herself appeared to be injured, though she continued issuing orders with calm precision. "All ships, this is Lexington," Chen's voice carried across the communication channels with absolute authority. "The enemy command is down. Press the attack. Show them what happens when they threaten human worlds." The response from her fleet was immediate and unanimous. Every surviving human vessel turned toward the nearest Zephyrian target and attacked with everything they had. Ships that were running out of ammunition used their hulls as weapons. Crews that were cut off from their vessels fought with whatever they could find. Individual humans who found themselves alone in damaged sections of enemy ships sabotaged critical systems before being killed. By the time the battle ended, both fleets had been effectively destroyed. Of the 800 Zephyrian vessels that had entered the system, fewer than 50 limped away, damaged, and demoralized. Of the 200 human ships, only 12 remained combat-capable. In any conventional analysis, the Battle of Kepler 442 should have been recorded as a Zephyrian victory. They had achieved their tactical objective of eliminating the human fleet and clearing the system for occupation. But something had changed in the way the surviving Zephyrian commanders looked at their enemies. Admiral Kreshtar had been replaced by his second-in-command, Admiral Thekvan, who immediately opened communication channels with the human survivors. What he said would echo through galactic military academies for decades to come. Admiral Chun, this is Admiral Thekvan of the Imperial Fleet. We did not expect such resistance. Your people fought with great courage. Chen's reply was transmitted from the bridge of the dying Lexington, her voice carrying despite the damage around her. Admiral, this was just the opening round. If you want to fight humans, you'd better bring more ships. As I sat in the observation deck of Station Omega-7, surrounded by displays showing the aftermath of the most savage battle I had ever witnessed, I realized that everything the galactic community thought it knew about humans was wrong. They weren't just another primitive species that would be absorbed into the Empire's vast bureaucracy. They were something entirely different, something that would force every military commander in the galaxy to reconsider what they thought they knew about warfare. The Zephyrian Empire had been expanding for over 1,000 years, conquering species after species through demonstrations of overwhelming force and efficient administration. They had never encountered a species that preferred mutual destruction to surrender, that chose death over subjugation, that turned their own vessels into weapons when conventional tactics failed. They had never encountered humans at war. And from the intercepted communications I was monitoring, I knew this was only the beginning. 3 weeks after the Battle of Kepler, 442, I received new orders that filled me with a mixture of professional excitement and genuine dread. The Galactic Observation Council wanted me to transfer to a mobile observation platform that would follow the expanding conflict between the Terran Federation and the Zephyrian Empire. What had begun as a minor border dispute was rapidly becoming something unprecedented in galactic history. The Zephyrians, shocked by their losses at Kepler, 442, had responded in the only way their military doctrine understood: overwhelming force. They had assembled a fleet of over 2,000 vessels and begun systematically destroying every human colony they could find. This should have ended the conflict within days, as no species could sustain such losses and continue fighting. The humans proved to be unlike any other species. Instead of suing for peace, the Terran Federation declared what they called a total war against the Zephyrian Empire. The translation protocols struggled with this concept, as no equivalent existed in galactic languages. The closest approximation was complete mutual destruction, but even that failed to capture the full implications of what humans meant when they spoke of total war. My new assignment placed me aboard the research vessel Insight, a sleek Kepler-designed ship equipped with the most advanced observation equipment in the galaxy. The crew was entirely civilian, scientists and technicians from a dozen different species, all united by a growing fascination with human military behavior. Dr. Yithera Sek, the mission's lead xenopsychologist, briefed me as we departed Station Omega-7. She was Altarian, a species known for their analytical approach to behavior and their ability to remain detached from emotional stimuli. Even she seemed shaken by what she had observed. The humans have done something we've never seen before, she explained, her crystalline features reflecting the light from the tactical displays around us. They've turned their entire civilization into a weapon. I didn't understand what she meant until we reached our first observation point near the Tau Ceti system. The humans had established what they called a fortress world there, transforming a previously peaceful agricultural colony into something that defied conventional military classification. The planet's surface was covered with defensive installations, weapons platforms, and industrial facilities that had been converted to military production. But what struck me as most unusual was the complete integration of civilian and military functions. There were no separate military bases or designated combat zones. The entire planet had become a single, massive fortress. How do they maintain civilian morale under such conditions? I asked Dr. Sek as we analyzed the surface installations. Her answer challenged everything I thought I knew about the relationship between civilian populations and military forces. They don't maintain civilian morale. There are no civilians. The data she showed me revealed the true scope of human mobilization. Every adult human on the planet had been assigned a military role, from manufacturing weapons to operating defensive systems. Children too young for combat duties were involved in support functions, maintaining communications, and caring for the wounded. The elderly used their experience to coordinate logistics and provide strategic planning. Most remarkably, this transformation had occurred voluntarily. The human government hadn't forced their people into military service. They had asked, and the population had responded with unanimous enthusiasm. Humans who had spent their lives as farmers, teachers, and artists had willingly become soldiers, technicians, and warriors. This level of social mobilization shouldn't be possible, Dr. Seck observed. Most species can maintain military production at perhaps 20% of their economic capacity before civilian unrest becomes unmanageable. The humans have converted 95% of their economy to military purposes without any sign of internal dissent. I began to understand the true implications of human total war. They weren't just fighting with their military. They were fighting with their entire civilization. Every human world had become a fortress. Every human ship had become a weapon. Every human citizen had become a soldier. The Zephyrians, despite their technological superiority and greater numbers, found themselves facing an enemy unlike anything they had encountered before. When they destroyed a human military installation, the humans simply built another one. When they conquered a human world, the population continued fighting as an insurgent force, making the planet worthless for occupation. When they destroyed human fleets, new ones appeared within weeks, crewed by civilians who had learned military tactics in converted training facilities. Our first close observation of human ground combat came when the Zephyrians attempted to occupy the mining world of New Appalachia. Intelligence reports suggested the planet's population was only 40,000, with minimal military infrastructure. It should have been an easy conquest, requiring no more than a regiment of Zephyrian troops. The assault force consisted of 5,000 elite soldiers equipped with the finest technology the Empire could provide. They landed expecting token resistance from hastily organized militia forces. What they found was a population that had spent 3 months preparing for their arrival. The humans had turned the entire planet into a death trap. Every building was fortified, every street was mined, every civilian was armed and trained in guerrilla warfare. The Zephyrian forces found themselves fighting not against a military, but against an entire civilization that had decided they preferred death to surrender. I monitored the communications as Zephyrian commanders tried to make sense of what they were facing. Colonel Vashtar, leading the assault force, transmitted increasingly desperate reports to his superiors. The enemy has no identifiable command structure. We destroy what appears to be their headquarters, and another one appears within hours. We capture what we believe are their military leaders, and the civilian population continues coordinated resistance. They're using children as scouts and the elderly as snipers. This isn't warfare. This is insanity. The human defenders, by contrast, seemed to understand exactly what they were doing. Their communications revealed a level of tactical coordination that should have been impossible for hastily trained civilians. But as I listened more carefully, I began to realize that these weren't civilians who had recently learned to fight. These were humans who had rediscovered something fundamental about their nature. Captain Maria Santos, commanding the New Appalachia Resistance, transmitted regular reports to Terran Command that revealed the human approach to impossible odds. They're better equipped and better trained than we are, but they don't understand what they're fighting for. Every position they take costs them more than they can afford. Every street they control requires troops they don't have. They can win every battle and still lose the war. What followed was 3 months of the most brutal fighting I had ever witnessed. The Zephyrians controlled the spaceports, the major cities, and most of the planet's infrastructure, but they couldn't control the population. Human resistance fighters emerged from hidden tunnels, struck at enemy supply convoys, and disappeared back into a population that gave them absolute support. The Zephyrians tried every strategy in their military doctrine. They offered generous terms for surrender, promising good treatment and integration into the Empire. The humans ignored these offers completely. They attempted to identify and eliminate the resistance leadership, only to discover that every human civilian was potentially a resistance fighter. They tried to cut off supplies and starve the resistance into submission, but the humans had prepared for siege conditions and showed no signs of weakening. Most disturbing to the Zephyrian commanders was the human attitude toward casualties. When the Empire's forces captured resistance fighters, they expected intelligence, cooperation, or at least pleas for mercy. Instead, they found humans who seemed genuinely surprised that their captors expected them to provide information about their comrades. They don't break under interrogation, Colonel Vashtar reported. We've tried every technique in our manuals. They simply refuse to acknowledge that cooperation is an option. Some of them seem to find our questions amusing. I began to understand that the humans were fighting according to different rules entirely. The Zephyrians approached warfare as a rational process, a means of achieving political objectives through the application of force. Humans approached it as something closer to a religious experience, a test of their fundamental nature that could not be compromised regardless of the cost. The turning point came when the Zephyrians decided to make an example of New Appalachia. Imperial doctrine called for the complete destruction of any population that could not be pacified through conventional means. Admiral Thek Van, now commanding the sector fleet, received authorization to bombard the planet from orbit until all resistance ceased. The human response to this threat revealed something about their psychology that I found deeply disturbing. Instead of attempting to negotiate or evacuate their civilians, they transmitted a message to every ship in the system. To all Zephyrian forces, you have chosen to make war on our children. You have chosen to destroy our homes rather than face us in honest battle. Very well, we accept your challenge. But understand that what you have unleashed cannot be controlled or contained. We are no longer fighting for New Appalachia. We are fighting for the memory of New Appalachia. And we will carry that memory to every world in your empire. What followed challenged every assumption about rational behavior in warfare. As Zephyrian bombardment fleets moved into position around New Appalachia, human forces throughout the sector launched simultaneous attacks on Imperial positions. These weren't carefully planned military operations designed to achieve specific objectives. They were revenge raids, pure and simple, intended to cause maximum damage regardless of cost. Human ships that had been hiding in asteroid fields and gas giant atmospheres emerged to attack Zephyrian supply convoys. Colonial militias that had been conducting defensive operations suddenly began offensive campaigns against nearby Imperial outposts. Even individual humans who found themselves on Imperial-controlled worlds began sabotage operations that achieved nothing except making the Empire's occupation more difficult and expensive. The bombardment of New Appalachia lasted 18 hours. When it was finished, the planet's surface had been sterilized, its population eliminated, and its infrastructure destroyed. By any measure of Imperial doctrine, this should have ended resistance in the sector and demonstrated the futility of opposing Zephyrian rule. Instead, it marked the beginning of something unprecedented in galactic history. Within days of New Appalachia's destruction, human forces throughout the galaxy began conducting what they called terror raids against Zephyrian targets. These operations followed no conventional military logic. Human ships would emerge from hyperspace, attack the nearest Imperial installation with everything they had, and fight until they were destroyed. They made no attempt to capture territory, establish strategic positions, or achieve any objective beyond killing as many Zephyrians as possible before dying themselves. Dr. Sek and I analyzed hundreds of these attacks, searching for some pattern or strategic purpose that would make sense of human tactics. What we found was far more disturbing than any military strategy. They're not trying to win the war, Dr. Sek concluded after weeks of analysis. They're trying to make victory meaningless. I began to understand the true horror of human total war. They had calculated that they couldn't defeat the Zephyrian Empire through conventional military operations, so they had chosen to make conquest so expensive and destructive that victory would be worthless. Every Imperial planet would require massive garrison forces. Every supply convoy would need heavy escort. Every Zephyrian citizen would live in constant fear of human revenge attacks. The Empire had started this war to acquire new territory and resources. The humans were determined to ensure that the only thing the Empire would acquire was an endless cycle of violence and revenge that would consume both civilizations. As I watched human suicide squadrons throw themselves against Imperial battle stations with no hope of survival, I realized that I was observing something that had never existed in galactic civilization, a species that would choose mutual destruction rather than accept defeat. The Zephyrians had conquered 47 star systems by demonstrating overwhelming superiority and offering reasonable terms for surrender. They had never faced an enemy that considered surrender a form of defeat worse than death itself. They were about to learn that some species would rather burn the galaxy than allow their enemies to rule it. 6 months into what historians would later call the Terran-Zephyrian War, I began to question everything I thought I knew about the nature of intelligence itself. My research vessel Insight had become a mobile archive of horror, documenting a conflict that had moved beyond warfare into something approaching cosmic madness. The transformation in human society had accelerated beyond what should have been biologically possible. When I first began observing them, humans had appeared to be a typical developing species with standard social structures and individual psychology. Now, after sustained combat against an overwhelming enemy, they had become something that challenged our fundamental understanding of sapient behavior. Dr. Ytherasek had requested transfer to a different assignment after witnessing what humans called the glass rain operation. I had been forced to complete her psychological evaluation myself, noting signs of severe stress that were unprecedented in her species. Altarians were known for their emotional stability, yet she had developed symptoms similar to those seen in primitive species exposed to traumatic experiences. They've stopped thinking like individuals, she had explained during her final report. Every human action is coordinated with their species-wide objectives. They've achieved a level of collective consciousness that shouldn't be possible in carbon-based life forms. I had initially dismissed this observation as an overreaction to the stress of witnessing prolonged conflict. But as I continued my observations, I began to see evidence that Dr. Sek had identified something genuinely unprecedented. The human fleet actions in the Proxima Centauri system demonstrated coordination that defied conventional understanding of military command structures. 300 human vessels, operating across a volume of space that made real-time communication impossible, executed a complex battle plan with precision that suggested they were sharing thoughts rather than relying on transmitted orders. The Zephyrian Admiral Kextau, commanding the system's defense forces, transmitted his confusion to Imperial Command. The enemy appears to be operating with perfect information about our positions and intentions. They anticipate our tactical decisions before we implement them. Our intelligence suggests no advanced sensor technology that could explain this capability. I began monitoring human communications more closely, searching for the technological explanation for their tactical coordination. What I found was far more disturbing than any advanced technology. The humans had stopped using conventional military communication protocols. Instead of transmitting specific orders and tactical information, they shared something they called the song. Individual ships and ground forces would broadcast fragments of music, poetry, and what appeared to be personal memories. These transmissions seemed random and chaotic, but the human forces receiving them somehow extracted tactical information with perfect accuracy. Captain Elena Vasquez, commanding the human cruiser Unbreakable, transmitted a typical example during the Battle of Wolf 359. The autumn leaves were falling when Sarah took her first steps. Mom cried because she knew Sarah would walk among the stars someday. The third moon rises at 2100. Sarah's memory deserves better than what we were offered. Somehow, the human fleet extracted from this poetic fragment the information that enemy reinforcements would arrive at the third moon at 2100 hours. They positioned their forces accordingly and destroyed the Zephyrian reinforcement fleet before it could enter the main battle. I spent weeks analyzing these communications, searching for the encryption method or coded language that would explain how tactical data was being transmitted through personal memories and cultural references. What I discovered challenged my understanding of consciousness itself. The humans weren't using codes. They were sharing genuine memories and emotions and somehow extracting tactical significance from the collective psychological state of their species. They had developed what could only be described as a group mind, though one that retained individual consciousness while enabling perfect coordination of group actions. This development was noticed by other galactic civilizations, though few understood its implications. The Kepler Confederacy issued a research bulletin suggesting that humans had developed new communication technologies. The Altarian Science Council hypothesized that humans had evolved rapidly under combat stress. The Centaurian Trade Alliance recommended avoiding contact with human territories until the war ended. Only the Zephyrians began to understand what they were truly fighting. Emperor Kreshval himself addressed the Imperial Senate. his words carrying a weight of concern that had never been heard from the ruler of the galaxy's most powerful military force. We are not fighting a species. We are fighting an idea that has achieved consciousness. Every human death strengthens their collective resolve. Every victory we achieve makes them more dangerous. We may have awakened something that cannot be destroyed by conventional means. The Emperor's concerns became evident when the Zephyrians attempted their most ambitious operation of the war, a direct assault on Earth itself. The Imperial High Command had assembled the largest fleet in their history, over 5,000 vessels representing the combined might of dozens of conquered species. Their objective was to capture the human homeworld and force an end to the conflict through overwhelming demonstration of power. The Battle of Earth lasted 72 hours and redefined the concept of desperate resistance. The human home system had been transformed into a fortress of unprecedented scale, with every planet, moon, and asteroid converted into a weapons platform. But what made the defenses truly formidable wasn't their technology or firepower. It was the absolute determination of the beings operating them. I monitored the battle from a position at the edge of the solar system, far enough from the combat to remain safe, but close enough to observe the tactics employed by both sides. What I witnessed challenged every assumption about the relationship between rational behavior and survival instinct. The Zephyrian fleet entered the system in perfect formation, their overwhelming numerical superiority allowing them to advance steadily toward Earth despite fierce resistance from human defensive installations. Imperial commanders followed their traditional strategy of demonstrating inevitable victory while offering opportunities for surrender. Admiral Thekvan, now commanding the entire assault force, broadcast the standard Imperial ultimatum. People of Earth, you have fought courageously, but further resistance is futile. Surrender now, and your world will be spared. Your people will be relocated to suitable worlds within the Empire. Continue to resist, and your homeworld will be destroyed. The human response came from Admiral Sarah Chun, who had somehow survived the Battle of Kepler 442 and been promoted to command Earth's defenses. Her words would be remembered by every species in the galaxy for generations to come. Admiral Thekvan, you have come to our home. You have threatened our children. You have demanded that we surrender our freedom, our dignity, and our future to your empire. We have considered your offer carefully. There was a long pause before Chun continued, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of an entire species' decision. Our answer is no. Not now. Not ever. Not if you bring 10,000 ships. Not if you threaten to destroy every world in our territory. We choose to stand here on this ground, at this moment, and show the galaxy what humans become when our backs are against the wall. If you want Earth, Admiral, come and take it. But know that taking it will cost you everything you are. What followed was the most savage 3 days of combat in recorded galactic history. The humans didn't simply defend Earth. They turned the entire solar system into a weapon. Venus had been converted into a massive fusion reactor, its surface installations generating energy beams that could destroy capital ships at planetary distances. Mars hosted magnetic accelerators that launched projectiles at relativistic velocities. The asteroid belt had become a swarm of automated kamikaze drones that targeted anything larger than a fighter craft. But it was the human defenders themselves who truly embodied the horror of their species of war. When their ships were destroyed, the crews used escape pods as weapons, ramming them into enemy vessels or detonating them near vital systems. When their space stations were overrun, the human defenders fought room by room, corridor by corridor, refusing to retreat even when facing overwhelming odds. The space station Olympus, orbiting Earth's moon, became a symbol of human resistance when its crew of 300 held off Zephyrian assault troops numbering in the thousands. The battle for the station lasted 8 hours, with human defenders using everything from military weapons to improvised tools to slow the Imperial advance. When the station's reactor was damaged and threatened to explode, the surviving humans didn't evacuate. Instead, they manually triggered the overload, destroying the station, themselves, and the entire Zephyrian assault force. Station Commander Lisa Park transmitted a final message before the explosion. Tell them we were here. Tell them we stood. Tell them that when they threatened our children, we chose to become something they could never understand or defeat. Similar scenes played out across the solar system as human defenders turned every installation into a fortress that could only be taken through its complete destruction. The Zephyrians found themselves advancing through a graveyard of their own creation, each victory costing them resources they couldn't afford to lose. By the end of the second day, Admiral Thekvan had lost over half his fleet and controlled less than 10% of the strategic objectives in the Sol system. His remaining forces were exhausted, demoralized, and facing human defenders who seemed to grow more determined with each Zephyrian victory. The final phase of the battle began when the human defensive fleet, which had been hiding in the outer system, launched their counterattack. These weren't the converted civilian vessels that had fought at Kepler 442. These were purpose-built warships designed and constructed during the months of total war mobilization. But what made them truly terrifying wasn't their technology, it was their crews. Every human aboard those ships had volunteered for what they called a final mission. They weren't planning to survive the battle. They were planning to take as many enemies with them as possible before dying. The human dreadnought Humanity's Wrath, flagship of the counterattacking fleet, transmitted its intentions as it accelerated toward the Imperial Command ship. This is Admiral Elizabeth Reeves aboard the Humanity's Wrath. We are all volunteers here, Admiral Thekvan. Every man and woman on this ship chose to die today so that our children might live free tomorrow. We want you to remember that when you explained to your emperor why his greatest fleet was destroyed by a species he thought was beneath his notice. The Humanity's Wrath died, taking the Imperial flagship with it, but its sacrifice triggered something unprecedented in galactic warfare. The human fleet didn't just attack the Zephyrian forces. They systematically targeted enemy vessels that might escape to carry word of the battle to the Empire. They were trying to ensure that the entire Imperial fleet would be destroyed, leaving no survivors to report on human capabilities. This level of strategic thinking while conducting suicide attacks demonstrated that the humans had achieved something that military theorists had considered impossible: perfect integration of tactical desperation with strategic planning. They were simultaneously thinking like cornered animals and like calculating military commanders. As the Battle of Earth reached its climax, I realized that I was witnessing the birth of something new in galactic civilization. The humans hadn't just become an effective military force. They had become a concept that other species would have to accommodate or destroy. Emperor Kreshval reached the same conclusion. On the third day of the battle, as his fleet faced complete annihilation, he transmitted a message that would echo through Imperial military academies for centuries. All Imperial forces, this is the Emperor. Withdraw immediately from the Sol system. This engagement is terminated. Admiral Thekvan, commanding from his damaged flagship, couldn't hide his shock. Your Majesty, we have achieved tactical superiority in several sectors. Victory is still possible. The Emperor's response revealed how completely the humans had changed the nature of the conflict. Admiral, victory against these beings is no longer possible. We can destroy their ships, capture their worlds, and kill their soldiers, but we cannot defeat what they have become. They have turned their entire species into a weapon pointed at the heart of civilized behavior. Every human we kill makes them more dangerous. Every world we conquer becomes a source of resistance that will drain our resources for generations. The surviving Zephyrian forces withdrew from the Sol system, leaving behind a wreckage of over 3,000 ships, and the realization that the galaxy's most powerful military had met something it could not overcome through conventional force. As I compiled my observations of the Battle of Earth, I understood that the humans had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had faced an enemy with overwhelming technological and numerical superiority and forced them to retreat through the simple application of absolute determination. But what disturbed me most was the realization that this was not the end of the war. The humans had proven that they could not be conquered by traditional means, but the Zephyrian Empire could not afford to appear weak before the dozens of species it ruled through fear and intimidation. Both civilizations were now committed to a conflict that could only end with the complete destruction of one or both species. And from what I had observed of human psychology under extreme stress, I was beginning to suspect that they might prefer mutual annihilation to any outcome that left their enemies intact. The galaxy was about to learn what humans meant when they spoke of fighting to the last man. The final phase of the Terran-Zephyrian War began not with military action, but with a simple question that would reshape galactic civilization forever. Emperor Kreshval, facing the complete breakdown of imperial military doctrine, transmitted a message to the Galactic Council that demonstrated how thoroughly the humans had changed the nature of warfare itself. Honored representatives, the Emperor's message began. The Empire requests immediate consultation regarding the classification of Homo sapiens as a sapient species. We believe they may represent a form of collective intelligence that falls outside the parameters established by the Galactic Accords. I was present in the council chambers when this message was received, having been recalled from my observation duties to provide expert testimony on human psychology. The reaction from the assembled delegates revealed how little the galaxy understood about what the humans had become during their months of total war. Ambassador Velthara of the Centaurian Trade Alliance spoke first. Surely the Emperor exaggerates. No species can maintain the level of military mobilization described in these reports without social collapse. High Chancellor Krimtel of the Kepler Confederacy was more direct. The Empire has conquered 47 systems over the past millennium. Are we to believe that a single primitive species has forced the galaxy's premier military power to request assistance? What they failed to understand was that the humans had moved beyond the conventional limitations of individual consciousness and social organization. During my months of observation, I had documented a transformation that challenged our fundamental understanding of what it meant to be an intelligent species. The humans had achieved what xenopsychologists called crisis-induced evolution, a theoretical state where extreme pressure forces rapid changes in a species' mental architecture. But what made their transformation unprecedented was its scope and permanence. They hadn't just adapted their military tactics. They had rewired their entire approach to existence. Dr. Essek Thorne, the Council's chief xenobiologist, presented the evidence I had gathered during my observations. The holographic displays showed brain-scan data that revealed structural changes in human neural networks, communication patterns that demonstrated collective decision-making abilities, and behavioral analysis that documented their complete integration of individual and group consciousness. The subjects designated as human have developed cognitive capabilities that place them outside our current classification system. Dr. Thorne explained to the Stun Council. They retain individual consciousness while participating in a species-wide information network. Every decision, from tactical battlefield choices to strategic resource allocation, is made with perfect awareness of its impact on their collective survival. Ambassador Selvar of the Altarian Science Council raised the question that everyone was thinking. Are we dealing with enhanced intelligence, or have humans become something post-sapient? Before Dr. Thorne could answer, the chamber's communication array activated with an incoming transmission. The source identification showed coordinates from deep space, far from any known human territory. The message itself was brief, but it would change the trajectory of galactic civilization. Galactic Council, this is Admiral Sarah Chun, commanding the Terran Deep Space Fleet. We understand that our war with the Zephyrian Empire has raised questions about our species classification and intentions. We would like to address these concerns directly. The council chamber fell silent. Admiral Chin's survival was news to most of the delegates, but her ability to transmit from deep space suggested that human capabilities had grown far beyond what anyone had imagined. Admiral Chun, Council Speaker Yashtero replied, the Council recognizes your transmission. However, we should note that you are currently engaged in active hostilities with a recognized member of the galactic community. Chin's response demonstrated the fundamental shift in human thinking that had occurred during the war. Honored Speaker, the Empire declared war on humanity by attacking our civilian populations. We have simply accepted their declaration and responded accordingly. We are not aggressors. We are survivors who have chosen to survive on our own terms. What followed was the most unusual diplomatic exchange in galactic history. Admiral Chun, speaking for a species that had been at war for almost a year, calmly explained to the assembled representatives of galactic civilization why humans could never be integrated into the existing order. We understand that our methods disturb you, Chun continued. We understand that our willingness to die rather than surrender challenges your assumptions about rational behavior. What you need to understand is that rationality itself is a luxury that depends on having acceptable choices. Dr. Yithera Sek, who had returned to council service despite her psychological trauma, asked the question that defined the fundamental divide between human and galactic thinking. Admiral, what outcome do you consider acceptable in your current conflict? Chen's answer revealed the true scope of human transformation. Dr. Sek, we have considered every possible outcome. Victory, where the Empire withdraws and leaves humanity free to develop independently. Defeat, where our species is exterminated but takes the Imperial fleet with us. Mutual destruction, where both civilizations cease to exist rather than one dominating the other. She paused before delivering the statement that would echo through diplomatic archives for millennia. What we will not accept is surrender. What we will not accept is absorption into an empire that views freedom as negotiable. We have chosen to become something that cannot be conquered, cannot be controlled, and cannot be integrated into your galactic order. If that makes us a threat to civilization, then we accept that designation. The implications of Chen's words struck the council delegates with varying degrees of comprehension. The humans had not just refused to conform to galactic norms. They had deliberately transformed themselves into something that could not conform. They had become a species that would rather destroy galactic civilization than submit to it. Emperor Kreshval's response came within hours of Chen's transmission, and it revealed how completely the war had changed Imperial thinking. The message was addressed not to the Galactic Council, but directly to Admiral Chen. Admiral, the Empire acknowledges that conventional conquest of your species is not possible within acceptable cost parameters. We propose a negotiated settlement that recognizes human territorial claims and independence in exchange for a formal treaty limiting human expansion beyond your current sphere of influence. What made this offer unprecedented was that the Empire was essentially surrendering to a species they outnumbered by thousands to one. But, as I had learned during my observations, traditional calculations of military power meant nothing when facing an enemy that viewed death as preferable to defeat. Chen's response demonstrated that the humans had moved beyond conventional diplomatic thinking as completely as they had transcended military norms. Your Majesty, we appreciate your offer, but it fails to address the fundamental issue. You began this war by attacking our civilian populations. You have demonstrated that you view other species as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be removed. A treaty with such an entity would simply be a delay before the next conflict. The Emperor's next message revealed the depth of his desperation. Admiral, what would the humans consider an acceptable resolution to this conflict? Chen's answer would reshape the galactic political order. Complete transformation of the Empire into a federation of autonomous species, with representatives from every conquered world participating in government. Immediate withdrawal of Imperial forces from all occupied territories. Reparations to be paid to every species that has suffered under Imperial rule. And formal acknowledgement that no species has the right to impose its will on another through force of arms. The demands were impossible from an Imperial perspective, but they revealed the true scope of human thinking. They weren't just fighting for their own freedom. They were fighting to restructure galactic civilization according to their own values. What happened next surprised everyone, including myself. Emperor Kreshval accepted. His formal statement to the Galactic Council explained his reasoning. The Empire has concluded that continued conflict with the humans represents an unacceptable risk to galactic stability. Their demonstrated willingness to accept mutual destruction rather than surrender makes them the most dangerous military force in known space. More importantly, their transformation suggests that other species may be capable of similar evolution if subjected to sufficient pressure. The Emperor had recognized what many council members were still struggling to understand. The humans had proven that any species could become ungovernable if they were willing to pay the necessary price. The implications for Imperial rule over hundreds of conquered worlds were obvious and terrifying. The Treaty of Terra, signed 6 months later, established a framework for what would become known as the Galactic Federation. The human demands were met in full, with the former imperial territories reorganized as autonomous regions governed by representatives from each species. The massive imperial military was disbanded and replaced by a volunteer force dedicated to defense rather than conquest. But the most significant change was the establishment of what humans called the Never Again Protocol. Any species facing extinction or enslavement could invoke the protocol and receive immediate military assistance from the Federation, including full support for the kind of total war mobilization that had made humanity unconquerable. The protocol was tested within 2 years when the Crystalline Collective attempted to expand into Federation territory. The humans responded by placing their entire military at the disposal of the threatened worlds, and the Collective withdrew rather than face the prospect of fighting an enemy that had already proven it could not be defeated through conventional means. As I compiled my final reports on human military psychology, I reflected on the fundamental transformation I had witnessed. The humans had not simply won a war. They had proved that consciousness itself could be weaponized under sufficient pressure. They had demonstrated that a species could choose to become something that existing power structures could not contain or control. More importantly, they had shown other species that such transformation was possible. The galaxy that emerged from the Terran-Zephyrian War was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. The ancient cycle of conquest and submission had been broken by a species that chose mutual destruction over defeat. The humans had forced galactic civilization to evolve or face the prospect of endless war against enemies that could not be conquered. But what haunts me most, even now, is the realization that I witnessed only the beginning of human potential. The transformation they underwent during the war was driven by necessity and desperation. What they might become when they have time, resources, and freedom to develop their capabilities deliberately remains unknown. I have seen humans at war. I have seen what they become when their survival is threatened and their values are challenged. What I witnessed still haunts me not because it was evil or wrong, but because it was so completely effective. The humans taught the galaxy that there are things worse than death, and that some species will choose those things rather than accept defeat. They taught us that consciousness itself can be a weapon, and they taught us that the word impossible is simply a limitation that some beings choose not to accept. The galaxy is safer now, more free than it was before the war. But sometimes, in the quiet hours when I review my observations, I wonder what price we all might pay if humanity ever decides that the galactic order they helped create is no longer acceptable to them. They showed us what humans become when they go to war. I pray we never have to learn what they become when they choose to go beyond war entirely.